F. Colley kept a brass chit in his shirt pocket for 22 months, and in all that time he never once closed his hand on a silver dollar. The chit was stamped good for trade only. He fed the Halloway outfit 3 meals a day, dawn coffee to lantern beans, and every payday they handed him more brass and never any coin. He didn't complain. A cook doesn't complain. He kept a tally instead, in a little grease-stained book, the way a man counts sacks of flour so none go missing. Then came the spring payout. Silas Halloway stood on the porch of his own store and read the ledger out loud, before all 20 hands and half the town of Dry Fork listening in. Man after man, he read it. And every man, by his book, owed the store more than he had earned all season. Owed. For beef he'd eaten and boots he wore. Halloway said it plain, so nobody could miss it. A man who eats my beef and wears my boots owes me, not the other way round. Not one hand walked off that porch with a coin in his pocket. So on the last Sunday before the circuit marshal reached Dry Fork, 20 men who had never once agreed on anything saddled their horses at dawn. And for the first time in their lives, they all rode the very same way. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Before I take you down that road with them, do this one thing: tap subscribe, because these are the stories they'd rather you never heard told. And comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this ride travels. Now, let me start where it started, and let me start it calm. Ephraim Colley signed on to cook for the Halloway outfit in the spring of 1883, on the Sweetwater in the territory of Wyoming, near a town called Dry Fork. I was 57 years old. I had cooked for 3 outfits before that one, and I had buried 2 of the men I cooked for, and I knew the difference between a hard boss and a mean one before I ever shook a hand. The Halloway range ran wide. You could ride a full day and not cross it. Grass to the horizon, Silver River cutting through, and the mountains sitting blue and cold in the west like they were painted there. It was beautiful country. I want you to know that first. I want you to see it the way I saw it that first morning, because it matters, later, how good a place can be and how bad a thing can grow up inside it. The men were good men. That matters too. There were 20 of them and me, drovers, mostly, and a couple of boys learning the trade. They came from everywhere. Texas, Missouri, one from clear across the ocean who never did lose the sound of it in his mouth. They didn't agree on anything. They argued about horses and cards and scripture, and whose mother made the better biscuit, which was a foolish argument to have in front of the man cooking their biscuits. But when the work came, they were one thing. You put 20 men around a herd in a lightning storm, and you find out fast what they're made of. These men were made of the right stuff. I fed them off a chuck wagon. Long tables when we were near the home camp, tin plates on the ground when we weren't. Coffee at dawn, black and mean enough to stand a spoon in, the way they liked it. Beans and beef and bread and whatever the country gave up, antelope some weeks. Fish when a man had time to pull them from the Sweetwater. I was good at my work. I say that plain because a man ought to know one true thing about himself, and that was the true thing about me. I could make a hard day a little softer with a good supper, and I knew it, and I took some pride in it. The youngest of them was Wesley Boone. 19, ears that stuck out and a laugh you could hear across the camp. He had a girl in town, a seamstress named Ada, and he talked about her the way boys do, like he'd invented the whole idea of loving somebody. He was saving to marry her. That was the plan. Ride 2-3 seasons, save his wages, buy a little house in Dry Fork, and settle down with Ada. He told me all this the first week, unasked, stirring nothing, just standing by my fire because a boy that far from home wants somebody older to talk at. I liked him right off. You would have too. Now here is how the trouble was dressed up to look like kindness, and I want you to watch it close, because it's the whole seed of the thing. Halloway paid $30 a month, good wages for the year. But he didn't pay in money. He paid in trade. Brass chits, stamped at his own store. Good only at his own store. When a new man signed on, Halloway would sit him down and explain it, friendly as a preacher. He'd say a cowboy's money never lasted. Said a man would ride into town on payday with a month's wages and ride out at dawn with a headache and empty pockets, having lost the lot at cards or bought it all in whiskey. Said the chits protected a man from himself. So your money can't wander off in a card game, he'd say, and he'd smile, and half the time the new man would thank him. Thank him. For being handed brass instead of silver. It sounded like care. I want you to sit with how much it sounded like care. That's the trick of a thing like that. It never comes at you wearing its true face. It comes at you smiling, holding the door, calling you son. I didn't thank him. But I didn't argue either. I took the chits and I put them in my pocket and I did what I always did. I wrote it down. $30, in trade, the date beside it. I wrote it in that little book with the grease soft cover that I kept in the wagon, the same book I kept my flour count in, and my coffee count, and my tally of who owed me tobacco. I wrote it down out of habit, the way a cook counts sacks. I never once thought the numbers would matter. I thought they were just numbers. I want to be honest with you about that. I didn't see it coming. I only wrote it down because writing things down was what I did. The first crack showed in the fall of that first year, and it was a small thing. So small I near forgot it. I needed coffee. Good coffee, not the burnt stuff Halloway kept in his store, which he sold at a price that would make a banker blush. There was a real mercantile in Dry Fork, a proper one, run by a man named Ostrander, and he kept green coffee you could roast yourself, and it was worth the trouble. So I rode in with a chit worth a couple dollars, meaning to trade it for a good sack of Ostrander's beans and make the men happy. The clerk took my chit, turned it over once in his fingers, and handed it right back to me. Didn't even set it on the counter, just handed it back. He said, "Halloway paper's no good but at Halloway's." Said it kind enough. Wasn't his fault. But he handed it back, and I stood there in that clean-smelling store with the brass warm in my hand, and I understood a thing I hadn't understood the second before. The chit wasn't money. Money is money anywhere. This was only money in one place. One man's place, and that man had built the place and set the prices, and there was no arguing with him about any of it. I rode back to camp with burnt Halloway coffee, and I didn't say anything to anybody. But I wrote that down too. The date. What the clerk said. Word for word. Halloway paper's no good but at Halloway's. I don't know why I wrote the words. Habit. Again. But some part of me, some part older than my thinking, had started to smell smoke. The second crack, I saw a man's whole face change. His name was Dell. A drover. A little older than the rest. Quiet. Good with a rope. No family that anyone knew of. Along about the next spring, Dell got restless. Some men do. The country gets small on them, and they need to see a new piece of sky. Dell decided he'd drift south, catch on with an outfit down in Colorado, see something green for a change. Nothing wrong in it. A man's got a right to quit and ride. So Dell went to the store to settle up, get whatever coin was coming, and leave. And Marcus Pell was there. Pell was Halloway's bookkeeper. A narrow man with ink on his fingers, and a way of looking at you like he was already writing you down. He kept the store ledger, the big one, the one with everybody's name in it. When Dell said he meant to settle and go, Pell opened that ledger and turned it around on the counter so Dell could see, and he ran his ink-stained finger down a column, and he told Dell that Dell couldn't settle up, because Dell owed money. $63, Pell said, for boots Dell had drawn from the store, for tobacco, for a blanket one cold month, for a slicker, and interest, Pell said. Interest on the season. $63, and Dell's wages, all paid in chits already spent at that same store on those same boots and that same tobacco, didn't come near it. By Pell's book, Dell had worked a whole year and gone backward. Dell owed the man he'd worked for. And here is the thing that fixed it in my mind. Dell couldn't leave. A man can't ride off owing a debt. That's not just a rule. That's a thing a man believes in his own chest, that you pay what you owe. And Dell believed it. So Dell didn't argue. He just went kind of gray in the face, and he closed his mouth, and he stayed. He put his hat back on and walked out to the corral and went back to work for the man who said he owed him $63. Nobody saw that but me. I was standing by the wagon with a sack of beans on my shoulder, and I saw Dell's face when he came out. I'll carry that face a long time. It wasn't anger. Anger I could have understood. It was shame. Dell was ashamed. Like the $63 was some failing in himself, some proof he was a poor hand and a poorer man, when the truth was he'd been robbed with a fountain pen. But he didn't know that yet. Neither did I, not the whole of it. I just knew a good man had walked into that store meaning to be free and walked out a debtor, and no coin had changed hands to make it so. Only ink. I wrote it down. $63. Dell, boots, tobacco, blanket, slicker, interest, the date. My hand wasn't quite steady when I wrote it. I remember that. Now I've shown you the small hurt and the one-man hurt. Let me show you the day it stood up in daylight in front of the whole town and stopped even pretending to hide. Spring payout. The end of a season's work. The day a man is supposed to feel the weight of what he's earned. Halloway made a thing of it. He'd have the whole outfit ride in, and a good part of Dry Fork would turn out too, because it was an event, the cattle money coming down, and folks like to stand near money even when none of it is theirs. They gathered in front of the store, 20 hands, townsfolk in a loose knot, women with parasols, the blacksmith with his sleeves rolled, kids underfoot. And Halloway came out onto the porch with the big ledger under his arm and Pell beside him like a shadow that had learned to hold a pen. Halloway didn't hand out wages. He read the ledger. He stood up there, and he read it out loud, name by name, in front of God and Dry Fork and every man who'd broken his back for him all season. And it was the same story 20 times. This man drew so much in boots. This man so much in tobacco. This man a doctor's visit when the horse rolled on him. This man his winter coat. And against each name, the wages, all in trade, all already spent at that store. And at the bottom of each name, the number, owed, man after man after man, and every one of them owed the store money at the end of a year of the hardest work God ever set a body to. You could hear the town go quiet. Not all at once. In pieces. A parasol stopped turning. The blacksmith stopped rolling his sleeve, because even folks who didn't ride for Halloway could do the sum in their heads, and the sum didn't work. And everybody knew a sum that doesn't work means somebody's got a thumb on the scale. And Halloway felt it, that quiet, and instead of it shaming him, it made him bold. He looked out over all those faces, and he said the thing I put at the front of this story, the thing I will hear in my sleep till I'm buried. He said, "A man who eats my beef and wears my boots owes me, not the other way round." And he closed the ledger like he was closing an argument, and nobody was paid a single coin. Wesley was there. My Wesley, the boy with the girl in town and the whole life mapped out. And when Pell read Wesley's name, Wesley owed the most of anyone. I don't rightly know how. A boy who lived on beans and coffee and spent his evenings talking about Ada, how does he come to owe more than a grown man who drinks and gambles? But there it was in the book. Wesley owed the most, and the boy went red. Red from his collar clear up past those stuck-out ears, red like a slap, and he looked at his boots, and he didn't say a word. Because he thought, you could see him think it, he thought it was his own fault. That he'd been careless. That he was a failure, 19 years old, and standing in front of the whole town, believing he'd somehow squandered a life he had barely started to live. Ada was in that crowd. I knew her by then, a small, dark-haired girl with quick hands and a straight back, and she'd walked over to watch her Wesley get his season's pay so they could start counting toward the little house. She watched him get read out as the deepest debtor of the lot. She watched him go red and stare at his boots. And I watched her face do a hard thing, which was to keep still and kind when her heart was surely coming apart, because she understood before Wesley did that the arithmetic was rigged to grow. The more he worked, the deeper he'd sink. The plan they had, save, marry, build, the plan was already dead, and it had been killed on paper by a man's fountain pen, and there was no fighting a fountain pen. Not that any of us knew of, not yet. I want you to hold Wesley's red face and Ada's still one together in your mind, because everything that comes after is trying to fix that one thing. 20 men, a Marshal, a whole storm of a reckoning, and under all of it, if you dig down, it's a boy and a girl who wanted a house and were told by a ledger they couldn't have one. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the wagon with the grease book on my chest and the stars coming through the canvas gap, and I finally let myself think the thought I'd been walking around for 2 years. This wasn't hard bossing. This wasn't even mean bossing. This was a machine. Halloway had built a machine out of chits and a ledger and a store where the chits were the only money that worked, and the machine ate a man's whole year and left him owing, and it did it legal, or looked legal. And every man it caught was too ashamed to say a word because each one thought he was the only one who'd failed. That was the beauty of it, from Halloway's side. It made 20 robbed men each feel like one guilty man. Alone, and alone, a man endures. He puts his hat back on and goes back to work. I had endured 2 years of it. I'd told myself that taking the brass without complaint was dignity. Quiet dignity, the kind my own father wore, the kind I'd always figured was the mark of a real man, to bear a hard thing without whimpering. But lying there that night, I felt the floor of that belief go soft under me. Because Dell had endured, and it kept him a slave. Wesley was enduring right now, going red and silent, and it was about to cost him Ada. My quiet wasn't dignity anymore. My quiet was the oil that kept the machine running smooth. Every day I said nothing. I was greasing myself. That was a hard night. I'm not too proud to tell you I wept a little, an old man alone in a wagon. Not for myself. For Dell's gray face and Wesley's red one and every plate I'd handed him. I want you to understand what a letter was, coming from me. I was the cook. Cooks don't write the owner letters. But I sat down with a good pen, and I wrote it plain, no fancy words, because I'm not a fancy man. I wrote that paying a man's wages only in trade good at one store, and then keeping a ledger of debts that forbid that man to leave, was not right, and I believed was not lawful. I didn't rage. I just said the thing true and clear. And then I did the part that mattered. I took the letter to the blacksmith, a solid man named Rourke who feared nothing including Halloway, and I read it to him and he watched me sign it, and he signed under it as witness, the date beside both names. So it couldn't be said later that no warning was ever given. So there'd be a record that a plain man told the boss, in writing, before witnesses, this is wrong and I believe it's against the law. Then I carried it to the store, and I handed it to Halloway myself. He read it standing up. He read it twice. And then, I swear to you. He laughed. A big warm laugh like I'd told him a fine joke at supper. He called Pell over and read him the best parts out loud, mocking my plain words in a plain voice. And then he took my letter, my witnessed letter, and he pinned it up on the wall of the store, over the scale where he weighed out flour, and he stepped back and admired it there like a picture. The cook's turned lawyer, he said, grinning at the men who'd come in. You boys hear that? Colley's going to have the law on me. Read it there and have a laugh, it's free. Everything else in here you got to owe for. And he laughed again, and the men who owed him too much to do otherwise laughed with him, and I turned around and walked out. Now understand. That felt like a beating. I'd worked up my whole nerve, and he'd pinned it to the wall like a shot coyote. But walking back to my wagon, past the corrals, something in me had gone hard and quiet and easy in a way it hadn't been in 2 years. Because a warned man is a different thing before the law than an unwarned one. Halloway had laughed. But he'd laughed at a witnessed paper that he'd then nailed to his own wall where the whole town could read it. He thought he was mocking me. What he'd actually done was hang up the proof in a public place that he'd been told plainly what he was doing and had chosen to keep doing it and had thought it so funny he framed it. I didn't know yet how much that would matter. But some patient part of me filed it away, the same part that wrote down Dell's $63, and it was satisfied. The letter was in the spring. The thing that changed everything came in the early summer, and it came the way big things do, by accident, on a scrap of paper. A deputy United States Marshal named Josiah Hark rode a circuit through that country. Twice a year, sometimes 3 times, he'd come through Dry Fork on the government's business, and he was the kind of lawman the country needed and didn't always get. Slow to speak, slower to draw, but straight as a plumb line, and no more scared of Silas Halloway than Rourke the blacksmith was. Ahead of his circuit, notices would go up. Court dates, wanted men, land business, the government's word to the territory. That summer, 2 pieces of paper came into my hands within a week of each other, and between them they lit the whole thing up like a lamp. The first was one of Marshal Hark's own circuit posters, tacked up at the mercantile in town. I read it while I waited for Ostrander to fill a flour order. Mostly it was court dates and the usual. But down at the bottom, small, it listed the kinds of matters the federal court would hear on its coming session, and among them were words I'd never once seen set down in print: debt, bondage, peonage, involuntary servitude for debt. It said the federal court would hear complaints of such, and it named a statute, a law, with a year beside it. 1867. The second was a newspaper. A Cheyenne paper, weeks old, that had come up with a freight wagon and gotten passed hand to hand till it reached my fire, soft as a rag. And in it was a piece about a case down in the Southern Territories, about a man who'd held workers by debt, and how the government had come down on him, and the piece explained the law like it was explaining it to a child, which suited me fine. It said that back in 1867, right after the war, Congress had passed a law abolishing peonage everywhere the United States held sway. Not slavery, which everyone knew was gone. This was a different, quieter thing. Peonage, holding a man to work by a debt he can't discharge. Making a man's labor the property of another because a ledger says he owes. The paper said that had been a federal crime for near 20 years. A crime. Not a wrong to argue in a courtroom over money. A crime that a United States Marshal could arrest a man for, that a federal judge could send a man to prison for. I read that piece by the fire 4 times. Then I read it a 5th. And I felt the whole ground shift under my life. Because I'd been thinking too small. All along I'd been thinking about my own pocket, my own chit, the brass I'd never turned to silver. And a man with 1 grievance and 1 chit, what is he? He's a complaint. He's one aggrieved cook against a rich man's word, and the rich man says the cook owes him for 2 years of beef and boots, and it's the cook's word against the ledger, and who's the court going to believe? 1 chit proves nothing. 1 chit is just a man who's sore. But I wasn't one man. That was the whole thing I'd been too blind and too alone-minded to see. There were 20 of us. 20 men, every one of them caught in the same machine, every one of them holding the same brass, every one of them read out as owing on the same porch on the same day, by the same book, in the same man's hand. 1 chit is a complaint. But 20 men who will all swear to the same system, under oath, before a United States Marshal, that's not a complaint. That's a verdict. That's a pattern. That's proof that it wasn't 20 men who each failed. It was 1 man who built a machine to rob 20, And that is exactly the crime the law of 1867 was written to break. I sat there with the soft newspaper in my hands, and I understood the vault I'd been standing next to for 2 years without knowing it. The evidence wasn't the chit in my pocket. The evidence was the ledger itself, Halloway's own proud book, the one he read out loud, the one Pell kept in his own careful hand. It was written down, in their hand, the whole crime, dated and named and totaled, in the villain's own ledger, because Halloway was so sure the law was whatever his book said that he'd never once thought to hide it. He'd read it out loud in front of the town. And my grease book, my foolish habit, 2 years of dates and figures written down for no reason but that writing things down was what I did. My grease book was the shadow of his ledger, kept honest, and between the two of them a man could show a court the whole shape of the thing. And then I understood the last piece, and it was the piece that made it possible. My warning letter, pinned to the store wall over the scale where the whole town could read it. A witnessed paper proving Halloway had been told plainly, in writing, that what he did was against the law, and had laughed and kept on. There's a difference in the law between a man who didn't know and a man who knew and chose. Halloway had nailed the proof of his own knowing to his own wall and called it a joke. I want to tell you I slept easy that night. I didn't. But it was a different not sleeping than after the payout. That night, I'd wept for what couldn't be fixed. This night, I lay awake building. Because now, I had to move slow, and I had to move careful, and I had to do the hardest thing of all, which was to take 20 proud, ashamed, scattered men who each thought his debt was his own private failing, and get every last one of them to see the machine, and stand up in it, and put his name to the same paper. All 20. Not 19. 19 leaves a hole. 20, all sworn to the same words before the same Marshal, that was the whole verdict, and one man short of it was just a mob of complaints Halloway could pick off one by one. So I began. I did it at the fire, at night. One man at a time. It's a thing about a chuck wagon fire that a man will say true things there he wouldn't say in daylight. I'd feed them. I always fed them. And then when the others drifted to their bedrolls, I'd keep one back with a last cup of coffee, and I'd tell him what I'd learned. Not preaching. I'm no preacher. I just lay it out plain, the way I'd laid out the letter. There's a law. From 1867. What Halloway does has a name, and the name is a crime, and it isn't your failing that you owe him. It was built to make you owe him. It's built to make every man owe him. You didn't fail. You were robbed. And here is the thing. One of us can't prove it, but all of us, together, swearing the same to the Marshal, that breaks it. That frees every man and pays back every dollar in real coin. You'd think men would leap at it. Some did. But shame is a heavy chain, and some of them had worn it so long they couldn't tell it from their own skin. A man doesn't like to hear he's been made a fool of for 2 years. It's almost easier to keep believing you failed than to swallow that you were played. I sat with that. I didn't push. I just told each man true and let it sit, and came back to him another night. And the beautiful thing, the thing I'll love those men for till they put me in the ground, is that once one saw it, he'd carry it to another. Dell, when he understood that his $63 was the exact proof of the crime and not the proof of his own poor handling, Dell came alive. Dell went and sat with the ones who wouldn't listen to me and told them plain. This many. Boy, this many. And so it spread, man to man, around that fire, over a couple of weeks, till there wasn't a hand in the outfit who didn't see the machine whole and want to break it. I drew up the statement plain, the same as the letter, because plain is what a court believes. Just a few lines. That I worked for the Halloway outfit, that I was paid only in store trade, that I was held by a debt I was told forbade me to leave, and that I swore it true. The same words for every man. Then, over those nights, each man made his mark. Some could write their name. Some made an X, and Dell or I would witness it and write the name beside. 20 of them. Wesley signed his whole name careful and slow, and when he set the pen down his hand was shaking, but not with shame anymore. With something else. With the front edge of hope. Which for a boy who thought he'd lost Ada to a ledger is a fearsome thing to feel. And I did one more thing. The thing I'm maybe proudest of, because it made the crime you could touch. I asked every man for one chit. Just one. One piece of the brass they'd been paid in place of money, and I took a length of baling wire and I strung those 20 chits on it, all in a row, brass after brass, every one stamped the same. Good for trade only. Good for trade only. 20 times down the wire. So that when the day came, I could lay it on a desk in front of a United States Marshal, and he wouldn't have to imagine it. He could hold it in his hand. 20 men's wages that were never wages, that could be spent at one counter and no other on God's earth, strung up like the truth on a wire. I kept the statements and the wire hid in the wagon, and I kept feeding the outfit their beans and their coffee, and Halloway suspected nothing. Not one thing. He rode past my fire and never slowed. He read his ledger to himself of an evening on the porch, sure as sunrise that the law was whatever his book said. He had no idea that under the flour and the grease and the everyday of it, his 20 hands had for the first time in the history of that outfit become one single thing, aimed at one single point, and that the point was him. But I want to tell you a fear, before I close this part, because it was real, and it never quite left me. 20 men holding one secret is 20 doors that can swing open. All it would take was one. One man too drunk at a dance. One statement found in the wrong place. One whisper to the wrong ear, and Halloway would break us apart before we ever reached the Marshal, and pick us off one by one the way he always had, alone and ashamed. The wire of chits and the 20 marks were hid in my wagon under the flour barrel that summer, and every day I woke wondering was this the day somebody found them, and every night I lay down having kept the secret one more day. And I hadn't yet moved them to a safer place, and Pell, Halloway's narrow bookkeeper with the ink on his hands, had lately taken to coming out to the wagon at odd hours, saying he was checking the stores against the account. Saying he wanted to have a look in the flour barrel. He came at dusk, with the light going long and red across the sage. And he had a lamp in his hand, though there was still light enough to see by. That was Pell. A man who brought a lamp to the daylight. He said it was the account. He said Mr. Halloway wanted the flour weighed against what the book said we'd drawn. I was at the fire. I did not stand up fast. A cook who stands up fast tells a man something's wrong. And I had spent a whole life learning to move like nothing was ever wrong. I stirred the pot. I said the flour was low, that I'd told him so, that the barrel was near the bottom, and he was welcome to look, but he'd get flour on his good coat for his trouble. And under that barrel, wrapped in oilcloth, lay 20 men's names. Lay the wire of chits. Lay everything. Pell knelt down by the barrel. He set his lamp on the tailgate. He tipped the barrel and looked at the flour going gray and low in the bottom, and he ran his ink-stained fingers around the rim of it like he was feeling for something. My heart was a drum. I kept my hand easy on the spoon. I said, mild as milk, that if he was hunting weevils I'd found none, and that Mr. Halloway's flour was better than the last outfit's, and did he want coffee? He said no. He straightened up. He looked at me a long moment with those narrow eyes, and I have thought since that he suspected the shape of a thing without knowing its name. He knew a cook shouldn't be that calm with a lamp in his stores at dark, but he had numbers in his head, not men, and the numbers said flour, so he wrote flour in his little book, and he went back up to the store. That night I did not sleep. I lay in the wagon and listened to the men breathing out in their bedrolls, and I thought, 20 doors, F. 20 doors and any one of them swings, and you're done. And I got up before the false dawn and I pried up the boards of the wagon's floor, the false floor I'd built for the Dutch oven and the good coffee I hid from the hands, and I laid the statements and the wire down in there, and I nailed the boards back and I set the Dutch oven on top. And when Pell came again, and he did come again, he found flour in the barrel, and nothing else. And he wrote flour in his book, and he never once thought to look down. That was the first time the door near swung. It was not the last. The second was Dell. Dell, who was quiet, who was good with a rope, who owed $63 for boots and a blanket and interest on a season he'd already given his back to. Dell drank at the dance in Dry Fork that July, the way a trapped man drinks, and the whiskey got into the place where the shame lived, and it lit it up like coal oil. I saw him across the floor with his arm around a hand named Roper, and he was leaning in close, and his mouth was going, and I saw the word forming on it before it came. I saw him start to say, "We've got Halloway." I saw him start to say the cook. I crossed that floor faster than a man my age has business moving. I put my arm around Dell like I loved him, which I did, and I laughed loud and easy, and I said, "Boys, this one's had enough of my coffee and somebody's whiskey." And I walked him out into the dark. He wept on my shoulder by the water trough. He said he was sorry. He said he couldn't hold it. It was too big to hold. And I told him the thing I told all of them that summer. I said, "Dell, you don't have to hold it alone. That's the whole trick of it. 19 other men are holding it with you. But you got to hold it quiet 3 weeks more. Just 3 weeks. Can you give me 3 weeks?" He gave me 3 weeks. He gave me his hand on it. Out there in the dark, sober enough to mean it. And he went back in and he danced and he said not one word, and I stood by the trough and shook for a while before I could go back inside. 20 doors. 2 had near swung. And then the third thing came, and the third thing was not a door swinging. The third thing was the deadline. It was a Tuesday when Halloway said it, on the store porch, loud, the way he said everything, because a loud man believes volume is the same as being right. He said come Monday he was shipping the big ledger to the bank vault in Rollins, said the book was getting valuable, said a man's accounts ought to be kept where thieves couldn't reach them. And he laughed when he said thieves, and looked out over us like we were the thieves, us who had never in our lives closed a hand on a coin he hadn't first turned to brass. I stood at the edge of that porch with an armful of dried beans, and I did the arithmetic of it in my head, the only arithmetic that mattered now. That ledger was the case. His own hand and Pell's hand, writing the crime down every day for years, calling it debt. Once it went behind a bank vault door in Rollins, no marshal on a circuit could lay eyes on it without lawyers and months and money we did not have. The evidence was walking out the door Monday, and Marshal Hark's circuit poster, tacked up at Ostrander's proper mercantile in town, said the deputy marshal would sit at Dry Fork the coming Sunday. One day. Sunday, and then he rode on, and there was no telling when the federal law would pass this way again. So there it was. God or the devil had set the clock. The ledger left Monday. The marshal sat Sunday. We had one day, and it was the day between. I told them at the fire, one at a time, the way I'd told them everything. I said Sunday. I said we ride Sunday, at dawn, together, every man, or we don't ride at all, because one man alone is a complaint, and Halloway breaks complaints for breakfast. 20 men is a verdict. I said the words I'd been saying all summer. One chit is a complaint. 20 men who'll swear to it is a verdict. And I watched each face take it, and not one face flinched. Not even Dell's, not even Wesley's, who had the most to lose, and the most owed, and a girl in town he couldn't marry on brass. Wesley came to me alone that Saturday night. 19 years old. Red still at the ears the way he'd been red at the payout when Halloway read his name, and called him the deepest in the hole. He said, "F," he said, "what if it don't work? What if we ride in there and swear and the marshal takes Halloway's side, and Monday we got no work and a debt and Ada waiting and nothing. What then? I put the coffee down. I looked at the boy, and I told him the truest thing I had. I said, Wesley, I don't know that it'll work. I've cooked for 3 outfits and buried men younger than you, and I have learned not to promise sunshine. But I know this. I know the law's been on our side since 1867, longer than you've drawn breath, and Halloway's never once looked to see. He thinks the law is whatever his book says because no one ever made him look. Sunday, we make him look. And whatever comes, you'll have stood up in the daylight with 19 men beside you instead of bowing alone in the dark. And that, son, that's the difference between a debt and a man. He wiped his face. He said, all right. He said, dawn. I did not sleep that night either. But it was a different not sleeping. It was the not sleeping of a man before a long ride, not before a gallows. They came at dawn. All of them. I heard the horses before the light, the soft blow and stamp of 20 animals being cinched in the gray. And I climbed down off the wagon, and I had the wire of chits in one hand, wrapped in a flour sack, and the grease book in the other, buttoned inside my coat against my chest, where I could feel the corners of it. And the men were mounted, and their breath and the horse's breath went up together white in the cold, and nobody said much. There wasn't much to say. Dell nodded at me. Wesley sat his horse straight for the first time all summer, and we turned onto the Dry Fork Road, the same road we'd rode 100 times to town for whiskey and flour and lonesome, and we rode it that morning as one thing. 20 men abreast where the road was wide enough, and strung out 2 by 2 where it wasn't, and I have never in my life seen anything I would rather have painted than that. 20 men who had never agreed on the weather, riding the very same way. Halloway's outfit. Riding away from Halloway. Toward the law. The Marshal's office in Dry Fork was just a room Ostrander lent the circuit, a plank table, 2 chairs, a stove gone cold. Josiah Hark was a lean man with gray in his mustache and a way of listening that made you feel he'd heard every lie ever told and was patient to hear one more. We filled his little room and his doorway and the street outside it. He looked up at all of us. He said that's a good deal of men for a Sunday. And then we swore. I want you to understand how it went, because it did not go with shouting. I had thought it might. I had thought there'd be anger let loose after all that holding. But it went quiet, and the quiet of it was worse for Halloway than any shouting could have been. One by one they stood at that plank table and put their hand up and said their name and said what was owed them and how it was paid, in brass, at one counter, and how the books said they owed instead. Dell said his $63 that he never spent. Roper. Then, the next man, and the next. And Wesley stood up and said his name, and said, I am owed for a full season, and the book says I am the deepest in debt of any man here, and I have a girl I mean to marry and cannot, on account of a debt I never made. And his voice did not shake, and Hark wrote it all down. Then I laid it on the desk. I unwrapped the flour sack and I laid down the wire, and the 20 brass chits ran along it and caught the window light, every one stamped good for trade only, and I said, Marshal, here is their money. 20 men's wages, that could be spent at Halloway's counter and no other place under heaven. And I laid my grease book down beside it, open to the columns, and I said, and here is 22 months of what I watched with my own eyes, wrote down out of habit, before I ever knew it would matter. Hark looked at the wire a long time. He picked it up and let the chits slide, listening to the small brass sound of them. Then he opened a book of his own, a thin-bound book of statutes, and he found the page, and he read it out loud to the room. He read that in the year 1867, the Congress of the United States had abolished peonage, which he named for us plain, the holding of a man to labor against a debt he cannot pay off, so that he cannot leave. He read that it was a crime against the United States. Not a matter between a man and his employer. A federal crime, and it was just then, of course, because God has a sense of the fitting, that Silas Halloway filled the doorway. He'd come to town for church or for the bank or to gloat. I never learned which. And he'd seen 20 of his horses tied outside a Marshal's door, and he came in loud the way he came in everywhere. He said, "What in the devil is this?" He said, "These are my men." He said, "Whatever these ingrates have told you, Marshal, I have got a ledger that shows every one of them owes me money, and the law protects a man's debts." And Hark let him finish. Hark was in no hurry, and when Halloway was done, I said the thing. I had not planned to be the one to say it, but it was in me, and it came out level and quiet, and I have never been more sure of a sentence in my life. I said, "You called it a debt. Mr. Halloway, the United States has called it peonage for near 20 years, and 20 men have just sworn to it." He looked at me then like he was seeing me for the first time. The cook. The old man at the fire he'd rode past 1,000 times and never slowed for. And I watched it start to reach him, what had happened here, that the thing he thought was the most his book, his brass, his men, had all this while been building itself into the rope for his own neck, down under the flour, out at the fire. Quiet, the way quiet people read the fine print. Now here is where I have to slow down, because each of them fell in his own way, and each way is worth the seeing. Halloway first. He did what men like him always do. He reached for the ledger. He had Pell fetch it. Pell was there by then, gray-faced, hovering, and he slapped it on the table beside my grease book, and he said, "There. It's all here. Every dollar. Look for yourself. The debts are real. I can prove every one." And he was smiling when he said it, because in his whole life the book had been the winning card. The book had always been the law. And Josiah Hark looked down at that ledger, and he did not touch it the way you touch a thing that saves you. He touched it the way you touch a thing that damns you. He turned the pages slow. And he said, "Mr. Halloway, I believe you. I believe every entry in here is real." And Holloway's smile started to come up. And Hark said, "And that is exactly the trouble, because this book, in your hand and your bookkeeper's hand, is a record of you charging men for the boots they worked in and the food they ate, and interest on the wages you never paid them in coin, so that they could not leave your employ. This is not the proof of a debt, sir. Under the statute I just read you, this is the proof of the crime. You have written down your own guilt every day for years, and had a man keep it neat." And I watched the smile die on Holloway's face by inches. I watched him understand that the harder he'd worked to make the book perfect, the more perfectly it hanged him. That's the thing about a man who believes the law is whatever his ledger says. He keeps a very good ledger. Then Pell. Marcus Pell. The narrow man. The ink on his hands. I almost felt for him, almost, the way you feel for a small mean dog that's only been what it was raised to. He saw the direction of it faster than Halloway did. He was quicker with a number, Pell. And he started to back away from the table, back toward the door. And he started to talk. He said, "I only wrote what I was told." He said, "Mr. Halloway told me the figures and I set them down. I never set a rate myself. I only kept the book. It's his book. It's not mine." And Hark looked at him. And Hark said, "Whose hand is this?" And Pell had no answer, because it was his hand, all of it. Every crooked column in his own careful writing, and the tally that was meant to be unassailable named him plainer than any witness could. Numbers on paper are unassailable, he'd always thought. He was right, they were. They just weren't assailing who he thought. Then, the town. And this is the part I'll carry to my grave with something like joy, so forgive an old man. Word went down the street the way it does, and by the time Hark walked us all up to Holloway's own store porch, the very porch where the ledger had been read aloud at payout, where man after man had stood red and shamed before his neighbors, by that time half of Dry Fork was gathered in front of it again. The same faces. Ostrander in his apron. Rourke the blacksmith who'd witnessed my letter. The women who'd watched us take our humiliation in the spring now stood to watch the reckoning in the summer, at the same rail, in the same daylight. And there was my letter. It was still there. Halloway had pinned it over the flour scale himself. Back in the spring, laughing, the cook's turned lawyer, meaning to mock me with it. And now, Marshal Hark reached up and took it down off the wall and read it out loud to the crowd. My plain letter. That said wages owed only in store trade, with a debt that forbids a man to leave, is against the law of the United States. Witnessed by Rourke, dated in the spring. And Hark said, "So you were told. In writing. Months ago. And you pinned the warning to your own wall and went on." And Halloway had no porch voice left for that. There is no loud way to answer a warning you laughed at and nailed up as a trophy. They counted the coin out that same afternoon. Hark saw to it. The debt's void by law, he said, every one, and the back wages owed in coin. Real coin, not brass. Halloway had to send to Rollins for silver, and it took some days, and I'll come to that, but when it came it was counted out on that porch in the daylight, into each man's own hand. Dell got his $63 that he'd supposedly owed, and more besides, all his real season's pay, and when they set the money in his palm, he just looked at it. He'd forgot what it was, near enough. 22 months, some of us. 2 years, near enough, of brass. And here was silver, and it was ours. And it would spend anywhere on God's earth, in Dry Fork or Rollins or clear to the sea, and no man could hand it back and say it's no good, but at one counter. Wesley got paid what he'd truly earned, and it was enough and more. Enough for Ada. He counted it twice and then he ran. Actually ran, 19 and long-legged, down the street toward the seamstress's shop, and I let him go, and didn't tease him for it, because some running a man's entitled to. And here's the cherry of it, the thing I could not have written better if I'd sat up nights. Some weeks on, after the silver was paid and the outfit scattered, most of the men gone to hire on honest elsewhere, Silas Halloway came out to my chuck wagon. On foot. Hat in his hand. The fall gather was coming, and he had cattle to bring in, and no crew to bring them, because no man in the territory would ride for Halloway now, and he'd heard, I suppose, that the men still had some regard for the cook. So he came to me. I was stirring a pot. I did not turn around. I heard him work up to it, the hemming. And then he said it. He said, "Colley," he said, "I find myself short of hands for the gather, and I'd take it kindly if you'd put in a word with the men." He said, "I'll pay a fair wage now." In coin. And there was something almost like begging under the loud of it, and I confess I let him stand there a moment in it before I answered. I said, still stirring, not turning, I said, "A fair wage now." And he said yes. And I said, "In silver." And he said yes. And I said, "In writing, signed, with a rate set before the season, and not moved after." And he was quiet. And then he said yes to that too. Because he had no cards left, the book had been his only card, and the book was in a federal file now. And I said, "And the chits?" He said, "What?" I said, "The brass. There's men still got chits in their pockets, and a wire of them in evidence besides. Every one redeemed at face, in coin, before a single man cinches a saddle for you. Then, and only then, I'll carry your word to them, and they'll decide, each for himself. And I won't say a thing to sway them either way." He agreed to all of it, standing behind an old cook who never once turned around. And then he went, and I let the pot be, and I sat down on the wagon tongue, and I found I was smiling, and there was water in my eyes, and I couldn't rightly have told you which it was, the laughing or the other thing, or whether at 57 a man gets to have both at once. I believe he does. I believe he'd earned it. Now let me tell you how it all sits, a year on. Because the anger's the story, but the peace is the point, and I'd not want you to leave the fire with only the fight. It's spring again on the Sweetwater. The light comes across the sage in the morning, the way it always did, long and gold, and doesn't care a whit for any man's ledger. I've got a little place now, nothing much, a stove and a shelf and a door that shuts. And every morning I pour myself coffee out of a good sack I bought in town with my own silver, at Ostrander's counter or the new man's at Holloway's old store. I can buy it wherever I please now, and I please to buy at different places just because I can. The grease book sits on the shelf. I don't write in it anymore. It did its work. A cook's tally, kept out of habit, that turned out to be the spine of the whole thing. I keep it the way you keep a tool that once saved your life. Wesley married Ada in the fall. She's small and dark-haired and quick with her hands, and she saw the trick of that ledger before Wesley ever did, saw the numbers were built to grow no matter how a man worked, saw their whole plan was already broke before they'd started, and she never once let it make her bitter, which is a strength I don't have and admire in the young. They've got a little house on the edge of Dry Fork, and over the door, I've seen it, Wesley nailed one brass chit, good for trade only, nailed it up over his own front door. I asked him why, and he said, so we don't forget. So we remember what it was, and what it wasn't. The store still stands. It pays in coin now, under a new man, a decent enough fellow who weighs honest and takes United States money like everybody else. And of the old crowd, well, they say Silas Halloway sold off the North Range to pay the wages he'd already owed, which is a fine kind of justice, a man selling his empire to buy back the labor he stole and then wouldn't pay for. And Marcus Pell, the narrow man with the ink on his hands who thought numbers on paper were unassailable, last anyone heard, he keeps books for no one now. Nobody in the territory will hand him a ledger. Turns out a man's careful hand can follow him. I've turned it over a good deal, this last year, at the fire and off it, and here is the whole of what I've come to, and then I'll let you go. Money a man can't spend, but at one counter was never wages. It was a fence. That's all it ever was, brass posts and a wire dressed up in the word pay. And here's the part that shames me and frees me both, and it's the truest thing I know. It only took 20 of us to notice the gate had never once been locked from our side. We stood inside that fence for years, each man alone, each man ashamed, each man sure the debt was his own failing, and it wasn't. It was a system. And the day we quit standing there one at a time and stood there together, all it took was together, the gate just opened. Like it always would have. Like it always could have. So if there's a fence around your days that everybody just agrees is a wall, I'd have you look close at the gate. Look who's standing next to you. And count, that's my story. 22 months of brass, and a grease book, and 20 men who rode the same road one Sunday morning. If you watched it to the end, I'm grateful, truly, and do me this one kindness. Comment the town you're watching from. I'd dearly love to see how far this ride has traveled.